Hi, welcome to Thinking Green, and I'm joined tonight by Greg Stroud. Some of you know Greg as the editor of CT Examiner, but it's almost 7 years after the first time Greg was on this show. I wasn't the host, but he was on this show talking about plans for high-speed rail service being enhanced in the Northeast part of the United States and what its impact would be on Connecticut. And 7 years later, I'm very happy that Greg is back again and to give updates on a plan that has kind of gotten re-energized or something over the last year or so.
So as I think last time we were here, there was a plan called NEC Future. And the idea was to, as you remember, it was to create a master plan for rail travel between Washington, D.C. and Boston, right? And there had been one plan that had been in place since 1976, maybe? 74, wow. 76, all the way until 2017. And so
wow.
That's a long time to have one plan, right? And so they wanted a new plan in place that would take us basically through our lifetimes. And they got that plan in place, and they released it in 2017. And so it's a master plan for the Northeast Corridor, Boston to Washington, except there's a big question mark, and that's in southeastern Connecticut and southern Rhode Island. It's actually the FRA drew a map with a dotted line around this area, and basically they said, you figure it out.
And we do have a picture of that map. So I think the first graphic that we have, the first slide, has the whole route and then a little blow up of the southeastern Connecticut, Rhode Island part. So maybe we'll be able to show it on screen as we talk.
It was, I was at a meeting yesterday in Stamford where all the bigwigs, all the train people, head of the FRA, the head of CTDOT, the head of Amtrak, they were all there. Lamont was there, and they said, they showed a map, and most of the map is smooth. It's pretty straight, pretty smooth. And then you get to, and there you go, you sort of see, then you get to eastern Connecticut and southern Rhode Island, and even that's sort of making it look smoother than it is. You see, there's all these wiggles. It just wiggles and it wiggles and wiggles on the shoreline. And that's partially because they built it, a lot of it in the 1850s, 1860s, even 1830s. And so the rail as it exists was not built for speed.
And this is sort of a,
There you see the circle around the area.
Yeah. And I think we have a second slide that might show it a little bigger.
There we go.
Yeah.
So that's not something that some press person made up. That's the official map for the Northeast Corridor master plan with a dotted line around it and no solution. They basically say, the federal government said, we're not sure how we're going to get from New Haven to Providence, but it has to happen within that circle. It cannot happen entirely on the existing corridor. And it has to meet, and this is key, it has to meet the same metrics for speed and capacity as our plan. Now, if you remember our plan, Rana, that was pretty controversial in southeastern Connecticut.
I don't even remember our plan.
Well, I'll say our plan, their plan.
Their plan.
Their plan.
Yes.
Their plan in the sense
Oh.
it was the Providence, it was the Kenyon to
Oh.
Old Saybrook bypass. So it probably, when that plan came out, it's essentially no one in Old Lyme, which was the '1 impacted community on the entire corridor, no one in Old Lyme had heard of it. And I think there were 5 days before public comment closed. That ended up being delayed. But Old Lyme ended up submitting more comments than New York and Philadelphia and Boston combined. So that was,
And it was done in a couple weeks.
it was done in basically 10 days. And so all of a sudden, down there in Washington, and we did a Freedom of Information request on the document. So we saw it. All of a sudden, they were like, "Uh-oh, we have something blew up in Old Lyme," and then from there it kind of spread. It really spread across Connecticut and into Rhode Island, where they questioned, even a lot of people that support rail. I support rail. I know you support rail.
Yeah.
They questioned, is this a good plan? And why did they settle on this plan? And I think people, it's not just anyone that thinks that planners are just making sort of transit planning decisions doesn't get the way government works. It's ultimately, there's that, but there's politics. And this was a transit solution, but it's also a political solution to a really difficult problem.
And so why was it determined that the metrics of speed and like capacity would have to be the same through Connecticut as from like Philadelphia to New York, for example?
So, I mean, this is the question. So when they finished the master plan in 2017, they erased that Kenyon to Old Saybrook bypass. They took it out of their plan. But I think they left in some rules. So it's not just free. You have some rules about how you solve that circle, how you solve the puzzle of getting from New Haven to Providence. And our question at the time, and our question still remains, do the rules presuppose the solution? So just because you erased the bypass, do the rules in place guarantee the bypass comes back? Or are there other alternatives? Could they go from Hartford to Providence? Or could they go up from New Haven to Hartford and across to Boston? Is there some other way to do this? I could say it's tough. It's a tough, and it's easy to advocate for southeastern Connecticut when you live down here, but we should, I think, as good people, we should take the impacts to eastern Connecticut and those towns every bit as seriously, and and to inform them and engage them and find the right solution.
Now, we do have some slides also that show the bypass, both the whole bypass and the sections, I think, from west to east. So we can show those while we're talking as well. But I had a very, very brief conversation with New London Mayor Passero a couple weeks ago and said to him, remember this thing? It's coming back. Okay, so I think
what you're seeing is this purple line is that's the official map from their documents. So that would be how you see the black at the bottom is the current rail, and the purple would be the higher speed bypass.
Well, and it is pretty obvious looking at this that the current pathway is not suitable for any kind of high-speed rail.
Yeah, it's really curvy, and people worry about sea level rise, but actually in the planning, which considers sea level rise, it says basically, it's built very high. Even though it dates the Civil War, the tracks are very high. They're more worried about flooding from rivers, which also deals with climate change.
Sure.
But that's the main concern in terms of flooding. But there it is. It would have, from the perspective of southeastern Connecticut, I think starting with Old Lyme, it would be 40. The original plan was an industrial bypass 40 feet high across the historic district, right near a national.
So that's 4 stories up, right through the historic district.
Just right a couple hundred feet away from a National Historic Landmark, and they're the Florence Griswold, and they're only, I think there's 62 now, 63 National Historic Landmarks in the entire state. And it would move across and go through a lot of rocky farmland or former farmland, and then it would hit around New London. It actually kind of takes off a little bit of the business district and then flies through between the bridges and between the Gold Star Bridge, and then it goes along the, and people say, well, why don't you just follow I-95? It's because I-95 is actually too curvy for high-speed rail, and it has too steep of grades. So they only want a 2% grade, and they really don't want curves. And so it sort of briefly flies between the Gold Star bridges, and then it kind of goes to the north. And through Mystic, it had a lot of opposition in Mystic because it might or might not, comes awfully close to the Mystic Aquarium in that area. And the real impacts, though, or other impacts, are in Charlestown, Rhode Island. And that's the second most impacted town on the entire Northeast Corridor. So Charlestown actually, when we were last on television talking about high-speed rail, Charlestown didn't even know the plan existed. Never heard of it. They hadn't heard.
So they were in the loop even later than Old Lyme was.
An entire year later. So it took a year before they found out. In fact, but when they found out, wow, it was quite an engagement. And in fact, Charlestown flipped the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, flipped her against the proposal. And this was a proposal in many ways that was designed to benefit Providence. So when the governor of Rhode Island comes out against Rhode Island's own plan, that's a big deal.
That is a big deal. So I guess what's happening now?
Now we have this master plan in place, which tells people say, oh, we beat NEC Future, I knew it would never happen, or all these responses. It's like, no, actually, NEC Future is here. It's currently the Biden administration, this bipartisan infrastructure bill, proposes $16.4 billion worth of spending on the Northeast Corridor, and every dollar is determined by NEC Future. And so that plan is in place determining every dollar that's spent, except what do we do about southeastern Connecticut and southern Rhode Island? And so they also, there were a few triggers that basically said, you can't electrify the Hartford corridor, for example, New Haven to Hartford corridor, until you solve this problem. You can't do any other big. So there's a few things that basically made sure that this wouldn't sit on the shelf too long. But they launched what they called a New Haven to Providence capacity planning study to solve this. And they launched it in November. It's funded. It will happen. It's happening right now. There's some early indications that an inland route, which I think a lot of people in southeastern Connecticut hope for, is probably off the table, but we'll see.
Now, for those of us in southeastern Connecticut, and this is, the west part of the bypass route, west to New London. For those of us in southeast Connecticut, the inland route seems pretty attractive because we could maybe get a few dollars to shore up our commuter rail.
Potentially opening up capacity for more commuter rail along the corridor It also potentially could help stores, where it would run through stores, and connecting Hartford to Providence might help Hartford. So there's some potential bonuses. Even if they moved it inland, or even if they built a bypass, there's no plan to remove the existing corridor. So it's possible if the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, has said to East Lyme, yes, we're building this bypass, but we're getting rid of the shoreline track, East Lyme might have said, wow, that opens up, all these marshes, all these beaches. This is a real boon. Right. But there's no plan for that. But there's some real fears as well, though, that if you take high-speed rail, you take the main route off of the existing coastal route, will the funding still be there to maintain or improve, or will all the dollars, with limited dollars, will they just all end up on that inland route? And I don't know the answer, but it's a reasonable question. There's limited dollars.
And a lot of this whole thing hinges on money, I assume, because it's a really expensive project.
A really expensive project. I think when I was here last and I was talking to Tim Hanser, the old host, I think the number we were batting around about $185 billion. Now, at the time, everyone said $185 billion. That's a massive amount of money. It's never going to happen. And then suddenly, COVID hit. And we started working in a scale of spending where 185, that's like a decimal point. How much fraud there was in COVID relief funds, it was far bigger than that. And so in some ways the scale made it seem more possible, yet on the other hand, how can it seem more possible when we spend all this money and we have all this debt? So will this happen? It is happening. Will they build a bypass? I'm not sure. What do you do with, it's always one of those questions, what do you do with a low probability, high impact project? Do you take it seriously? And I would suggest people take this seriously.
So we do have some pictures of what happens Groton east of the river, and then a little bit, and then another section eastward from like Stonington into Rhode Island. So to get a little bit more idea what the impact is. Now you mentioned an impact in Stonington. Where does it go through there that it would really,
So it diverges. Stonington actually has a couple of curves.
Okay, that's still the
That's still. There we go. And now we're working right around. Where are we here? We're actually we're on the sort of Groton side. I believe,
we're on
right
the Groton side there.
And you see that it's trying to follow along 95 as best as it can. There we have the Mystic that's concerning people. And again, you see 95 kind of curving along, and the new bypass in the orange and yellow is fairly straight. So that impacted, particularly concerned people in Stonington. It's a major commercial and sort of tourist hub for the state, and so I think people want to be careful with it. I think there you see a real divergence, and that's when we get over to Rhode Island, and suddenly it's starting to plow through nature preserves and farmland, and people were just, I think, rightly concerned, or rightly upset that they weren't involved and they weren't notified properly. So, and that's part of us. I've always been a pro-rail kind of person, but I believe that government is supposed to follow the law. They're supposed to act in an ethical way. They should engage the public. And sometimes the public is amazingly frustrating, and that's democracy, and that's how it should function, I think.
Yeah, if the public didn't do anything, then that would be a loss of input that's needed.
Yeah, and in fact, the initial plans really didn't reflect the true impacts of the proposal, and I think that there was a sense at the time in government, and we did the Freedom of Information request way back in 2016, and we saw that the Connecticut DOT and the FRA and Amtrak and all these officials, they had basically made the decision before they had ever opened it up to public comment, before they were sort of, there was this kabuki, sort of this little play
Right.
where everyone pretends that the decisions are still going to be made and haven't been made, and then we look at their emails and they say, we've decided. And so we kind of called them on it. And I'd say that the measure of our success at the time was that we beat the plan so decisively that even its proponents at the time, which included the Malloy administration, CTDOT, and the opponents actually cheered when it lost. Like, we won, guys, and it's like, wait a minute here.
Yeah.
And so right now it's come back, and there's some things that we didn't. In some ways, we know what the beast is, but we better than we used to. But there are a lot of pieces in the puzzle that blocked this proposal at the time that do not exist anymore, and probably won't. So if you're waiting for the white knight to come, let me tell you, or if you're concerned about this, trust me, you out there listening, you're the white knight. Because at the time I had a nonprofit, Seacoast. That nonprofit is no longer exist. The Connecticut Trust, which was Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, no longer has any expertise or involvement in transportation or planning. They're out of that business, and maybe not coincidentally, considering the role they played. Charlestown, Rhode Island, which was key to blocking this, now has the government is flipped, and that government, in fact, calls the whole train issue a hoax. So because their competing party had actually have been very successful, in part because they helped fight it. So Charlestown, Rhode Island isn't coming to your aid if you're in New London. The Connecticut Trust isn't coming to your aid. Seacoast isn't coming to your aid. I worked in a more activist role. I'm not coming to your aid either in that sense, because I edit a newspaper and I can inform you, but I'm not. But it's not my job.
Right.
And
it would get in the way of what your job is.
Yeah. And my job is just to, I can have an editorial opinion, but our news is not going to advocate against this proposal. We're just going to tell you how it is, and hope you guys do a good job and come to the best possible solution, whatever it is.
Now, I was reading, I came across when I was going through paperwork and trying to, organize my life a little, a letter that was jointly written by the three New London town committees, all three letterheads on it. And, the Democrats, Republicans, and Greens rarely all agree on one issue, but it was a joint letter. And one of the issues brought up, and I want to ask you, where were these stations supposed to be for this high-speed rail?
So this one, New London, the bypass would not service the current New London station. It basically would. There was I believe it was what did they call it? Now I've forgotten. Is it a Mystic? It's a Groton, New London train station that happened to be over the former dump. And it wasn't, so you had to drive to get to high-speed rail. So, and that, that's sort of a criticism. If this bypass saves roughly 15 minutes and you end up having to drive to the station, and actually in this case, a high-speed rail wouldn't even, part of the reason it's high-speed is it doesn't stop.
Right.
So it's not stopping. Maybe it stops once a week in
even the
in southeastern
Acela really,
Connecticut.
most.
Where?
doesn't always stop in New London.
Rarely stops. And that was a conversation we had at the time. I remember coming from Old Lyme. Personally, the last thing I wanted to do was to come to New London and advocate for something that wasn't good for New London. So the point was, I remember sitting down in an office with Mike Passero and with Andre Baumgartner, who had just, I think, one of the youngest state reps, and a group of other people, and we sort of hashed out, is this good? Is this good for New London? And I think at the end, Mike Passero made the decision, I think, that it wasn't, and that there just wasn't enough. There wasn't enough passenger service, and the real fear in towns like New London is there's just very little land. So much of it is taken up with highways and trains and bridges and frankly in nonprofits, that there's very little land that helps support, there's little tax base. So losing just a little bit becomes actually kind of an existential issue for New London. And it's just one too many things.
And I think the other concern that came up in this letter that all of our political parties agreed on was, we do have a multimodal transportation hub here.
Yeah.
The ferry comes, the highway exits are close to the train station, and development of that multimodal hub is really important for like the vitality of downtown New London.
Absolutely.
And this totally, bypasses it.
It's one of the problems. If you actually look at the basic planning behind high-speed rail, is that it's designed to serve large cities, with a dense core, and Connecticut doesn't have one.
Right.
And maybe Connecticut should have one. And maybe that's Hartford or maybe that's Stamford. But Connecticut doesn't have one. So the biggest beneficiaries of this plan are, frankly, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, Providence. And so Connecticut has just a disproportionate share of the impact. And so what do you do as a state? You don't want to, transit's important, rail's important. But what do you do when all the impacts and few of the benefits are here in the state? You engage.
Yeah, it's a hard problem. For me in New London, I have to say, going to Boston by just regular Amtrak is fine. It's like an hour and 40 minutes from New London to South Station. And to New York, it's a little bit more, but not that much. I can imagine people going to longer distances want things quicker, but if I can get to a big city in 2 hours or less on a train, I'm happy.
And this was some of our argument. We said basically that if the benefits are 15 minutes, then can't we say 5 minutes on parking, 5 minutes on ticketing or boarding, 5 minutes on reliability, have a more better connections and a more comfortable travel, and you just have your office right there. And so who really cares about the 15 minutes? And so in some ways that's part of the issue is that NEC Future created a vision of high-speed rail that was big enough to actually have some pretty serious impacts, but it wasn't big enough to have like those transformational sort of speed and capacity changes. It's still sort of a kludge, right? And so I think there have been other plans, and in fact, Bob Yarrow, who was sort of initially the father of this high-speed rail proposal, and it kind of then went on its own way. Bob Yarrow sort of envisioned one going across Long Island and then across the Sound and up through Hartford. And it's like a really big Robert Moses scale project. But he said, basically, if you're going to build something, build it big enough that people have some dream. You really you can see the benefit. So it actually doesn't run at 100 10 miles an hour. It actually runs at 210 miles an hour. So there's something to be said, but that one hasn't been built either.
Right, and I keep thinking, before the show we mentioned I've gone back and forth on the Eisenhower, interstate system many times over the decades. At the time it made a lot of sense. Cars were really coming into their own, but the way it spurred development, sprawl along the highways rather than having dense population centers around fixed points, really kind of makes it hard to almost retrofit. And rail preceded it, I know, but to retrofit a better rail system around that seems like a real challenge.
Yeah, we made a decision, and it was partially a decision that dealt with Cold War considerations at the time to build this highway system, and now we're facing car travel, trying to get rid of all the carbon that we're spewing into the atmosphere, and rail is presented as a more environmentally sound solution, and that's certainly a plus for rail travel. But then we still deal with the fact that most people will still have to will be getting in a car, or once they get off that train, or to get home, and that's just it's a puzzle about how we live, and I go back and forth on it as well.
When you were saying that, you still have to get into a car when you're at the station. Many, many years ago, Todd O'Donnell, who was the past owner of Union Station in New London, was on the show, and he was saying, when anyone travels, it's the last 2 miles of their trip that's the hard part.
And so there's some pilots right now, transit pilot programs in Connecticut that are on demand, sort of mini buses that take people, and there's some and the projects. It's a question of how much it costs. Is the money there? The projects seem to be, some of these last mile projects seem to be fairly successful. There's one right now around the Groton-Madison area. There's another one, I think it's heading up in Essex, Old Saybrook, in these areas. It's a problem. I live in a rural area myself, and because I like the quiet, and I'm afraid that a lot of people move to or live in southeastern Connecticut in part because they kind of aren't looking for the urban experience. And so what do you do? And a lot of those people care deeply about the environment.
Sure. Well, since you were talking about money, whenever rail comes up, whether it's high speed or commuter, the extent to which the passengers' trips are subsidized comes up. And sometimes the numbers do sound really high. But I was going to ask you, has anyone actually calculated what the subsidies are for our automobile travel?
It's enormous. They're enormous. It's hard to it's really hard to put a number on it. I mean, part of the reason right now that there are aircraft carriers in the Red Sea is because we like to get in our cars and drive, right? The highways we build, the medical costs of pollution, and which are a lot more people die from the pollution spewed out of cars than you would imagine, and those have costs. So in the case of Shoreline East, which has been close to eliminated at this point, it's basically
it's been reduced to where a lot of people don't use it because it's not convenient.
Yeah, and so at this point, and that's done. It wasn't done accidentally. People knew this was going to happen, but basically, part of the problem was that the rail at the end of COVID, it was even before COVID, it was around $134 per passenger trip as a subsidy. Now, on the one hand, it actually wasn't that much money because there weren't that many passengers. So, but it still amounted to roughly $25 million And so in the last budget, there was a decision made to cut that $25 million because it just didn't seem to make sense to pay that much for that few passengers. But at the same time, the government says we're supposed to build transit-oriented development, and we're, all these other things. So we've got kind of a disconnect. I don't know if it's robbing Peter to pay Paul or what's the right metaphor, but it's hard to have transit-oriented development without transit.
Yeah, well, I had occasion over the last month to drive up to Hartford a few times. And from New London, I drive up Route 11. And they just did road work on it. So in addition to the pollution and the other costs of, the fossil fuel use during driving, just road maintenance, they had just repaired a part of it. And that whole 8 or 9 miles on Route 11, I might see 10 cars.
Yeah, it's very quiet.
It's very quiet. And I'm wondering, that trip of mine is subsidized somewhere.
Yeah. It's subsidized in a lot of different ways. It's because car travel is embedded into the American economy and American culture. And I think in some ways it's not all bad, right? When you're fired from your job and you live one place, if you have a car, it's much easier to go to find some other job. You have this, the whole economy has a flexibility based on the fact that there's a more mobile population. And our economy right now, I think a lot of young people, frankly, are wary of getting tied down after they saw what happened in 2008, 2009, and their parents stuck in some house and that they can't afford. And a lot of young people don't want to be in that situation. I like to, on weekends, I like to go out and go to small towns, and part of my job is to go to restaurants. I need to go to more restaurants, and that takes a car.
And that's work. You have to do it, right?
You have, and it's if you don't live in a city, it's awfully hard to live without a car. And it's one of those cases where right now we have plans to build housing, and for many reasons, it's a good thing in many ways, but plans to build housing and subsidized housing in all these towns across Connecticut. But the problem with that is that, as I say, density evenly distributed is sprawl.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what the policy is right now. There's no policy that says, we really need to grow New London. We really need to grow Stamford. We sort of really to focus on creating a dense city that might actually benefit from something like rail in a real way.
I totally agree with you. I'm concerned about the cost of housing, not for me personally, but for the upcoming generations. But I also, as an environmentalist, Connecticut has a pretty static population, and it has for a few decades. Why are we turning and paving open space and turning that into housing when we have, could do infill development in our cities and make them more dense?
And I certainly know in New London, one of the conversations that I've had with your development, head of development, Felix Reyes, and with Mayor Passero, is just you get this really strong sense that they want to grow. They want to grow New London and grow the population, in part because that grows the tax base. It makes supports the businesses, make things happen. And so one of the things that I was looking for yesterday when I was in Stamford, remember at this big train meeting, is I saw the map and I saw there was a dot, and that dot said New London. And I said to myself, I looked around and I already kind of know no one from southeastern Connecticut was actually invited to this giant
So
conclave.
you were as close to New London as anyone in the room.
So yep. And so, but I looked and I said, I wonder if these officials, if the governor, if they're going to offer some kind of carrot. I mean, a profound carrot to like a town like New London. Maybe instead of plowing, thinking that they could plow through southeastern Connecticut, as they tried in 2016, 2017, maybe they try for a plan that really offers something. And I didn't hear it. In fact, I didn't hear any mention. There was a brief mention of housing in New London, but otherwise there was a big silence. And that's sort of troubling because the reason that this plan in some ways got frustrated, and the reason why southeastern Connecticut was such a sore thumb for rail and high-speed rail, is because they tried to plow it through this region and they failed. And will they try it again? Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. So I remember that 6-7 years ago, a lot of our public officials really joined the fight against this bypass. From Senator Blumenthal and on down.
Yep.
So where does everyone stand now? Our representatives in Congress, the governor, our state reps?
So in terms of the governor, I haven't talked to Governor Lamont about this, but we surely will. He's certainly a strong proponent of rail. We have talked to Senator Blumenthal, and he is strongly opposed to a return of the bypass. Chris Murphy is a little different. Chris Murphy seems to, and really since 2017, has sort of rethought or backpedaled, or initially came out very strongly against the bypass, and more lately he's talked about the need for, I think, dislocation was one word he used, and another word he has used was the need to break eggs. And so the idea is that that maybe for the greater good, that maybe the impacts are worth it. So we'll see. In terms of the small towns, I think they're just waking up to it. So several of Mike Passero was there last time. He's there again. But many of the towns have new governments, and so there's a learning curve.
Now, the towns that would potentially be impacted, you said they weren't represented at this meeting you were at. Are they in the loop yet, or is this just starting?
The first organization, the first town board, any place on the Northeast Corridor between Washington and Boston to really come out in opposition to some of this planning was actually the Historic District Commission in Old Lyme. And that was in January of 2016. And the Historic District Commission just sent a letter, maybe on Friday, last week, just sent a letter, a query letter, not necessarily opposition, but asking for more information about the planning. What kind of plan are we in? There's a very technical sort of legal definitions of what stage. They call them tiers sometimes. Are we in a tier 1? Are we in a tier 2? Does it need an entirely new, what they call an EIS, a big environmental study? And we don't know the answers yet. And so they sent a letter trying to figure this out. And a little warning to say, let's not do it the same way we did last time.
Now, in your recent article in the Examiner, you had a conversation with Representative Courtney, and it sounded as though one of his takeaways is that they are sensitive to following a public process. Do you feel like that's a sincere desire, or just a sensitivity, or?
There's certainly a sensitivity. I don't, the proof is in the pudding. And we're early in the process. I can't say that I've seen anything sort of wrong happen. I think there's some question there with those interviews with Courtney about what exactly this new study entails, and whether or not this would basically require a new bypass, and it kind of does, where it is. And lastly, there was one little nugget that came out of Courtney's talk with the Federal Railroad Administration and Amtrak, and that was, they said that basically they had done a market study, and they did that last year. They did a study of the potential financial benefits of high-speed rail and different routes. And that study came out with the conclusion that, there isn't much synergy between Providence and Hartford. And since there's no synergy, why link them? And, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's probably true. But on the other hand, because they're not really linked, sometimes you sort of, so do you plan for what's already there, or do you plan for what could be? But the key there is that without that market study is basically hinting, it seemed that they were taking a direct route between Hartford and Providence off the table. And if that's the case, there aren't many other routes than
Right.
something equivalent to the Kenyon to Old Saybrook bypass.
And for me in Southeast Connecticut, going from Hartford to Providence kind of does make sense, but it's easy for us in Connecticut to get to Providence, and that is part of it. Just a regular Amtrak train can get us to Providence.
For me, what in exchange, if there are inevitably going to be significant impacts to Connecticut, it feels like there should be some clear benefit, something that can truly help in a transformational way, help Connecticut. And perhaps a high-speed rail route between Providence and Hartford could be an amazing boon to Hartford. And, fixing and improving and helping Hartford. Now that's something that a lot of people could get on board, I think. And so that's one possibility. There might be other ways that potentially could help Hartford. Certainly when we were down in Stamford meeting with all these officials, there was a reason, because Stamford is a city that actually has more commuters coming to Stamford than leaving. It's one of the few places in Connecticut. So the people come out from New York City to Stamford to work. And and anything that furthers that, sometimes they call Stamford the city that works. And certainly it's a city that's growing.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking how Joe Courtney at one point was a big proponent of the Central Corridor line, New London to Mansfield and beyond. So it would be nice to develop that. So we have, I'm told, 4 minutes left. And in that last 4 minutes, maybe you can give people an idea of where we are now, what should we be doing, and what can we anticipate over the next few months?
So, I don't have a precise timeline on when this capacity planning study, this study to determine the solution here in eastern Connecticut and southern Rhode Island, I don't know when that will finish. But I do know that it's enormously important for your local towns to engage. Positive, negative, just engage. Be part of the conversation. Tell them your concerns, your desires, and now is the time to do it. And you can either, we'll have a new story on this whole issue tomorrow. Ideally, if I get it written tonight. Tomorrow, and that will have a little bit of advice about where you can write. But now is the time. Talk to your first selectman, talk to your mayor, and say, what are you doing to engage this? And so far, the towns that have really started to engage are Stonington and Old Lyme, and everyone else has been kind of quiet. But it's time to wake up.
Well, thank you, Greg. It wasn't all good news, but It's always a good idea to be informed about things that are potentially going to impact our lives and our towns.
It's, to me, it's all about, I just believe in public engagement, and I believe we'll have better outcomes if you guys are talking to your state representatives, talking to your first selectmen, talking to your Congress people. Maybe it's time you might give your thoughts to Chris Murphy and to Blumenthal, because they'll be key in this issue. They were key last time, and they'll be key this time as well to get the best possible outcome.
Well, thanks again, Greg. Next week, our guest is Allie Matterson-Quinlan from Magic Press. They'll be talking about just arts programs, projects, events coming up in New London. So we're going to shift things a little. But keep an eye open as CT Examiner, I imagine, will have the most comprehensive and continuous coverage on this issue of any of our local papers.
I think we've got the best. I think we have the best coverage, frankly, between Boston and Washington, D.C. We know it. And if you have a question, write to me at editor@ctexaminer.com, and I'll reply to my email.
Okay, and I can attest to that. Greg replies to the email. So, and you'll have to come back and talk about your first few years at the Examiner too, because it was brand new when we talked about it 4.5 years ago.
Yep, we're just about to 5 years, our anniversary, so maybe for that. I'd love to be on.
Well, thanks again, Greg, and for all of you, we'll have this show posted on our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.
When the rain don't